Good morning. It's Wednesday, the 29th of December. It's your Great British Breakfast with Simon McCoy and me, Ellie Costello.
Scotland's First Minister is due to give an update later today on COVID restrictions as case numbers near record highs. It follows new rules on social gatherings, which came into effect on Monday.
Emergency services remained at the scene last night of a huge blaze that broke out in Belfast docks. Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue, which had 6 fire engines in attendance, said scrap metals at a disposal yard caused the fire to burn for some time.
And 2 new coins designed to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee being unveiled by the Royal Mint. The release of the 50 pence and a £5 crown is the first chance for collectors to own a keepsake from the Platinum Jubilee collection. And we want to hear from you, of course. What are your New Year plans? Have they changed as a result of what's gone on over the last week? And if you're in Scotland and Wales, are you booking a train journey perhaps to England? Let us know. Get in touch. gbviews@gbnews.uk.
It's the Great British Breakfast with Simon and Ellie. Let's start the day by taking a look at some of today's newspaper front pages. Let's start with the Telegraph, and on the front page there they say Test and Trace is not having its finest hour. They've been telling people to isolate incorrectly, according to the paper. Messages are still asking people to isolate for 10 days when new guidance has actually been cut to 7 days.
The Mirror's offering us some positivity with the headline New Year, New Hope. There's a growing feeling that Omicron will not swamp the NHS after Professor Sir John Bell said the worst of the pandemic may well be over.
The Daily Mail's led with cut isolation to 5 days. After last week, the period was slashed from 10 to 7 days after testing negative 2 days in a row. There's also a story about the Harry Potter reunion, which won't feature J.K. Rowling.
The Times also leading with the story of cutting isolation. The Prime Minister is being urged to cut isolation periods to relieve stress on the NHS. And there's a fear for thousands of children being stuck in illegal and unregistered schools, according to an Ofsted director.
On the front of The Independent, why has the Ashes gone so wrong for England? A question many people will be asking this morning. They're taking a deeper look into the team, and higher taxes and bills cause chaos, they say, in the cost of living, with families facing a £1,200 hole in household budgets.
We get The Guardian. It's gone for a cost of living front page. It says next year UK families could face a hit of £1,200 as wages fall and bills rise. A leading think tank says households face a cost of living catastrophe.
The Eye leads with hospital cases climbing, but serious illness from Omicron remains lower. It says the number of COVID patients in hospitals has risen 38% in a week to 9,500. But the good news is there's no increase in the use of ventilators.
And The Sun leads with Ravehearts. Ravehearts, very good. Pub landlords in England are bracing themselves for that invasion of Scottish and Welsh drinkers on New Year's Eve. It's expected that almost 100,000 could cross the border to avoid the COVID restrictions.
Yeah. On a different note, The Star leads with Elon. We have a problem. China has complained to the UN after an Elon Musk satellite had a near miss with its space station.
And an optimistic front page in the Daily Express today, Dare We Hope? Worst of COVID is history. It claims that scientists believe the worst of the COVID is finally over as jabs reduce deaths.
Now, this morning we have a panel to go through the stories inside the papers. We're fortunate to be joined by journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani and Spiked Online editor Tom Slater. Well, I think the top story for us today is that Nicola Sturgeon press conference that we're expecting this afternoon. She's going to give a COVID statement, and that's as cases reach record levels there. Already have restrictions in Scotland on Boxing Day, and that's what's really interesting, isn't it? The use of different rules in the devolved nations. Nabila, let's start with you.
Well, absolutely. I mean, here we are, about 2022, and the papers are still absolutely jam-packed with coronavirus stories. I mean, just 2 years ago, many of us couldn't spell.
Nabila, I'm just going to stop you for a moment. We've got a microphone issue. So what I'm going to do is, Tom, I'm just going to bring you in because this Dare We Hope, this word hope is a word that we've not heard throughout this whole pandemic until now.
Yes, very refreshing. It's on the top of the front page this morning. The Express is on this intervention from John Bell.
Do you know what, Tom? We've got a problem with yours as well. So what we'll do is we'll come back to you both in just a moment. Sorry about that. We'll get that sorted and return to our papers in just a moment.
Here's what else is going on today. The NHS is launching a fresh campaign to encourage people to get their COVID booster jabs. The vaccination programme has sent around 650,000 text messages and 50,000 letters to people who've not yet received their top-up dose. The campaign wishes them to have a jabby new year. Awful.
Emergency services remained at the scene last night of this huge blaze that broke out in Belfast docks. Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue, which had 6 appliances there, said scrap metals at a disposal yard caused the fire to burn for quite some time.
The cost of policing the Insulate Britain protest has cost the taxpayer at least £4.3 million. The group, which wants the government to insulate all UK homes by 2030 to cut carbon emissions, repeatedly blocked major roads between September and November, causing long traffic jams. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said he was appalled by the bill.
And millions of families are facing a cost of living catastrophe due to soaring energy bills and rising taxes. The Resolution Foundation said from next April, families would typically face a £1,200 a year hit to their homes as the energy price cap is raised, and there's a 1.25% increase in national insurance contributions, which comes into effect as well.
More than half of British people feel positive about their local community, but only 40% describe the area where they live as welcoming. A survey conducted by the Birmingham 2022 Queen's Baton Relay said climate change, mental health and opportunities for young people are 3 areas that should be improved next year.
And 2 new coins have been designed to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. We'll be looking at those a little later on. And you may have a comment on that £4.2 million bill to police Insulate Britain protests. Staggering. And Grant Shapps among those. Appalled, he said, at that cost. Let us know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.uk. Well, let's return to the paper review and let's say hello again to Tom and to Nabila. And Tom, we were talking about the front page of a couple of papers, talking about hope for the first time during this entire pandemic.
I know what a change of note that marks this morning. So a couple of the papers have picked up on these comments from Professor John Bell from Oxford, involved in the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine, who is essentially saying what's been clear for some time, which is we're not in the position we were in last year. He says that the images of kind of soaring hospitalisations and deaths is really a matter of history now, because of the fact that we have this vaccine rollout, because of the fact that Omicron seems to be milder, and also we have all of these antiviral drugs which are coming on stream, which seem to be really helpful as well. So whilst a lot of people are naturally being concerned by that soaring graph of cases, because of all of these protections we have, it's not going to translate into what we saw last year, and we may even be edging our way out of this, it seems like.
And the bill we've been talking about
Nicola Sturgeon, and whilst she may recall Parliament there today, a lot of people looking at the difference between the nations of the United Kingdom, and at the moment this is playing to Boris Johnson.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what seems to be emerging is that New Year celebrations are at least going to be saved in England, but I can see a lot of people who will be staying at home anyway. The Sun's front page is quite interesting and amusing, dare I say. It's just it goes on headlines on Rave Heart, which is of course a pun on Braveheart, with the Mel Gibson character pictured with a bottle of beer and scripted with the line, she may take our nightclubs, but she'll never take our freedom. And that's, of course, in reference to those restrictions brought about by Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's boss. And the paper predicts that 100,000 of Scots are ready to cross the border to party. So the hardcore of revellers will be out on the street, and they will be joined by people from Scotland and indeed from Wales who want to avoid the restrictions there. And it's interesting, of course, that England seems to be taking, some might say, a lot more risks than other countries in Britain and indeed in the EU, where a lot more precautionary measures have been brought in. France, for example, has used coronavirus passes for cafes and restaurants for many months now. And there's a lot more restrictions that are being brought in, including on food and bans on food in transports and indeed in cinemas.
Well, I want to talk, you spend a lot of your time in France. I just wonder what they make of what's happening in the UK.
Well, there's a weird restriction, for example, a new rule that says that you're not allowed to drink and eat while you're standing in a cafe or in a restaurant now. And they look at England and indeed Britain as being a bit reckless, dare I say, and not strict enough. But as we've seen over time, there are very stark differences between the two leaders, Boris Johnson.
In many ways, Nabila.
Absolutely.
Tom, there is a sense of optimism in the papers, isn't there? As we just touched on the Express, the worst of COVID is history, but England is an outlier here, isn't it? Not only in the devolved nations, but also in Europe.
Well, that's true, but I think Boris Johnson is hoping the bet will pay off in the same way that it did during the summer, because when England reopened more or less in full back in July, this again was seen as a huge outlier. It was branded as this unethical and dangerous experiment by various experts. But at the same time, it paid off as far as up until Omicron came along, not only in terms of cases, but in terms of hospitalisations and deaths and all the rest of it. Things were much more stable in the UK in comparison to, certainly in comparison to Europe, where a lot more of these restrictions have been in. And I think it's worth remembering, though, that when Scotland and Wales took the decision to introduce more kind of post-Christmas measures, they did so without the data that we have now. They were being precautionary. And at the moment, fingers crossed, it does seem like things are holding up in England despite those lack of restrictions. So I think Boris Johnson is counting on this being another one of those gambles, paying off, allowing people to be more free, but also being able to get through that without it putting that pressure on the health service, because we have all of these defences that we didn't have.
Yeah, Nabila, these are all the scientific facts, the medical warnings, but of course politics is playing a role here, and Boris Johnson was under huge pressure not to change anything.
Well, yes, indeed, but to a certain extent, he also has to take advice from the scientific body and people around him who advise him on health. I mean, let's not forget that the number one duty of a government is to keep people alive. And that's what Boris Johnson seems to be focusing on by taking advice from his scientific team. But, dare I say, he also has businesses in mind, and he's very keen on keeping the country's businesses open, at least for the moment, before any revisions are brought into focus. But this is also in this sense, the lead story in the Daily Mail, where basically you have scientists and MPs and business chiefs who are urging Boris Johnson to follow the US examples of cutting self-isolations to 5 days and reduce it from 7 days to avert staff shortages that threaten the NHS, but also the wider economy. So that's, you know, in a way, these kinds of pragmatic changes about how we deal with coronavirus will become more and more prevalent as we learn to live with the pandemic. And one of the great challenges, dare I say, of course, will be to keep everybody updated with all the constant changes. And I certainly detect an awful lot of confusion, not just among ordinary members of the public, but also amongst officials.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, there is an economic cost to all of this as well, isn't there? I mean, the Times is reporting, Nabila just touched on it there, staff shortages are now a bigger threat than patient numbers in hospitals. And if we look to hospitality in Scotland and Wales, they're going to be empty. There's no New Year's Eve celebrations there, which is their busiest time of year. It's going to be a very difficult time for them, isn't it?
It's going to be incredibly difficult, as you say. For a lot of hospitality, really the Christmas period and December is where they make so much of their money, because January is always so quiet. And so this is really key time for them. And even as a result of the guidance that the government has put out in relation to England, where we don't have these restrictions, has had a huge impact. I'm sure many of people will have seen completely kind of ghost town pubs and restaurants, particularly in the run-up to Christmas. So I guess hopes that because we've had this more encouraging data, people feel more confident to come out will have some sort of an impact, because even just the kind of ongoing guidance has such a huge impact on those businesses, particularly hospitality, as you say.
Nabila?
Well, the Mirror sums it up. The year of the squeeze, 2022, is going to feel very painful indeed for a lot of families and individuals who will be pushed on the edge. It's a horrifying prospect, not just because of rising gas charges and taxes, but you know, we have to bear in mind that with so many problems caused by the pandemic, it's easy to forget that the economics can have such a devastating effect on the lives of ordinary people.
Right, you two. I know you're staying on throughout the morning, you lucky things. Nabila, Tom, thank you for now, and we'll see you later on. OK, let's take a look at the pages of the newspapers. Joining us once again, journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani and the spiked online editor Tom Slater. Thank you both for staying with us this morning. Tom, let's start with what is for many the main story and the different approaches of the nations of the UK to COVID. And the word hope has started appearing on front pages.
Yes, so we're actually seeing some good news for a change. So the comments made by Professor John Bell made a lot of the papers this morning, talking about how we might actually be heading our way out of this. He says that the kind of hospitalisations and death rates that we saw at the peak of this, we're just not going to see these again because of the fact that we know that Omicron is less likely to land you in hospital, but also because we have all of these vaccine defences and also we have all of these antivirals coming online as well. So just stressing the fact that whilst many people will have been spooked by how many people were catching the virus over the Christmas period, this is not going to translate into the kind of illness and death that we saw before because we're in such a different position to what we were last year.
And Nabila, you spend a lot of time in France, and England is now the outlier, not just in the devolved nations, but also in Europe.
Well, yes, indeed. France, for example, has a very different approach, a lot stricter there, with the passes that had been introduced months ago to go into cafes and restaurants and the likes. New restrictions are being brought in, including bans on food and on transports and indeed in cinemas. You are now not allowed to eat while standing up in a cafe or in a restaurant. So there are very clear and marked differences between the two countries. I mean, not least of all in the vaccination rollout, as we've seen a constant standout between Emmanuel Macron and indeed Boris Johnson in the vaccination saga over the summer in particular. But here we are, I mean, dare I say, about to enter 2022, and the papers, incredibly, are still jam-packed with stories about coronavirus. And just 2 years ago, many of us couldn't spell the word coronavirus, and we had less of a clue of what it was about. But it seems incredible that we're now about to enter the third year into the pandemic, and it's starting to feel like that the 2020s are going to be defined by this terrible pandemic.
Just looking at the political implications of this, I mean, Boris Johnson has taken quite a gamble. It seems to be paying off at the moment, but time will tell.
Time will tell, but you know, as many of the papers are talking about today, you do have this different response, not just in comparison to England and Europe, but even within the United Kingdom, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, taking a much more cautious approach, you know, closing nightclubs, introducing more restrictions and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I think it's worth remembering that when Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford made those decisions, it was before that we had the data that we have now. It was very much a precautionary measure. And I think given what we're seeing, I think we could easily see in a situation within a few weeks where Boris Johnson is very much vindicated for taking this move, not because it was a crazy gamble, but because everything we knew about the Omicron variant originally has more or less been confirmed by more data, as far as it being less virulent, as far as it being something which does more or less hold up against the vaccines, particularly if you're triple jabbed. And because of the strength of our booster rollout programme, this is something that we can definitely weather. So yes, it's a gamble in a sense, but I think, if anything, it could be a similar situation to the reopening in the summer where Boris Johnson ends up being vindicated because of this.
A gamble by Boris Johnson, but of course, how much is it actually worth there being different restrictions in different nations if travel between us all is so easy? Nabila?
Well, I suppose the good news overall is that, you know, there are less hospitalizations in England, and tragic deaths are down as well. But otherwise, as we're seeing, figures are rocketing with all kinds of records being broken. But I think all these stories reflect the fact that, you know, England apart, this is all leading towards an over-regulated society. I mean, all countries seem to be going down that path, and it will be paradoxically, it will be very hard to apply all these regulations, which will inevitably lead to a lot of anger and indeed frustrations. I mean, coronavirus is now going to affect every aspect of our lives, from shopping to travelling, and it's incredible how life seemed to be quite simple before COVID-19. There was less bureaucracy, certainly, and less to worry about generally.
Now, both of you, thank you very much. You're back later in the programme, but Tom and Nabila, for now, thank you very much.